The media is amazing at making us think the world is consistently going to end. Now it's Trump tariffs and the conflict between Iran and Israel, or how even AI is just going to take all of our jobs. The fear just never ends. But what do the actual facts say? I've been through many market cycles, and I have the privilege of having many professionals and close mentors that have gone through many more. In this episode, I'm going to open up how you should be really looking at a potential recession, how to understand the facts through the noise, and what some of the greatest investors in the country choose to do while others just do nothing. I'm Iannuzzelli, and this is what school should have taught you. Let's get into it.
Everything school should have taught you in one place. With a property portfolio of over 17 million and an accountancy firm of over 16,000 clients, as well as being an accountant to some of the wealthiest people in Australia, Jeremy Iannuzzelli will be sharing his lessons on everything school should have taught you so you can build the life you want.
So I'm going to start with how you should be looking at a potential recession and what does it actually mean? Now, there's a lot of factors that make up the framework of when we think we're in a recession or when we're not. Now, here in Australia and most places around the world, there hasn't been as much growth. We've had China, which again, some of their numbers can be quite controversial, but nowhere near the level of growth numbers that they've had over the last 5, 6, 7, if not 20 years. You've had America that's shown a lot of weak numbers, although still crazy from an inflation perspective. A lot of things are chopping and changing on a daily basis off the back of tariffs that are getting thrown around between various different states. I know here in Australia, we're very worried about steel and the tariffs around what we send to China and then what China send to America. And there's 50% tariffs on between the US and China at the moment. I know I've got clients that do rely on distributing their goods from China to the rest of the world, predominantly to the US economy. So there are things in there which are definitely slowing a lot of the subsectors here in Australia and the sub-business sectors here in Australia down. Now, if you're up to date with a lot of global and economic news, you would know that in New Zealand, their property market is falling and actually falling faster than it's been in a lot of recorded history. In the US, especially if you look around a lot of those cities where a huge portion of migration went to, like Austin, Texas, they're starting to see significant declines in property prices. Places like California and pretty much predominantly a lot of the East Coast, minus some small parts around Florida. Even China, who's been a darling as far as the property market is concerned, even they're starting to see a major pullback. But Australia, we seem to just kind of always bubble along and buck the trend. Why? Because we do have such a strong export industry. Even when exports are weak, we're still doing all right on a per capita basis. But that doesn't mean we're a recession-proof country. We still are subject to a lot of the global economy because when you float your dollar and you're involved in global trade, you are subject to global economy factors. We've had a lot of issues with Israel and places like the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians, now Iran. We've had still war going on between Russia and Ukraine. We've had America get involved at various different parts. You know, there's been so much issues around trade. It's actually quite a volatile geopolitical time that we're living in. And it's so hard for the market to really get a grasp and understand, well, where is a normal market? What are normal prices? Where is normal market fluctuations? Things seem to be up one day, down the next, 10% one week, down 20% the other. So it is very hard for many people to really predict where they should be putting their money. More people that hold on to money, less money floats around the economy, then you start to have a retracting economy. That retracting economy leads to recessions. Now, I've said it on this channel before, and you're going to have to dig all the way back to my very early episodes, but interest rates going up are generally trying to cool down the economy. The economy's ramping up. You've got wages going through the roof, cost of goods and services going through the roof, the market's overheating, the economy's overheating, and the Reserve Bank and federal banks all the way around the world use interest rates as a lever to be able to bring the economy back down to normal. Now, what happens on the other side? Rates coming down. Yes, it's a hip hooray moment for many investors or many homeowners or many people with debt, but rates coming down means the economy is either A, starting to normalize, or B, becoming weaker, where it needs a substantial amount of stimulus. Because reserve banks and federal banks aren't going to put rates down to zero while the economy is running hot, because then you get a significant amount of inflation. And as I've said it on this channel before, inflation is cancer, and if you don't get control of it too early, it runs rampant, and that's where rates go all the way up to 20% like they did in the late 80s, crushes economy, and then you have not just a year or two of recession, you have decades of recession. So it's important that the reserve banks and federal banks around the world, they play this, cat and mouse game, this bit of a ballerina dance to make sure that they balance on one foot with the economy going up, but also rates stabilising. Now, with rates coming down and more rates coming down, I think here in Australia, they're doing the best they can. I think they're getting a soft landing on rates going up and a soft landing on rates coming down. But again, time will tell, and that history will be written in time to come. But nevertheless, to consider rates coming down a lot means that us as Australians, we're facing recession. That means business at the moment is not doing the best. And we've had thousands upon thousands, more than ever before, business closures and liquidations, more than I've ever seen in my history of being an accountant. So that means while there's some people doing really well in the economy and businesses flourishing, you've got a lot of businesses struggling. I've noticed within my client base a significant pullback in terms of spending. I've also seen in my client base the growth that they've experienced in the FY25 year compared to the earlier years due to that COVID pandemic boom that we had has significantly subdued. Their numbers are not crazy. Their expenses have very much stabilised, but their revenue has not grown. So that tells me that things are not rampant. Things are not growing at stupid rates. Revenue's not being made left, right and centre, but this is a bit more of a holding pattern, and hence people are saving and holding on to more of their money. And that's what typically they do during high interest rate times. They hold on, put into their offset account, pay down debt. They'll have a look at some opportunities. But what that means for many sophisticated investors on the fears of recession is as people are holding their money close to their heart and, the market's retracted, they'll actually be looking to spend during that time. They'll actually be looking to purchase and invest during that time because there's not a huge amount of demand in the market. And again, we've seen a lot of the top end of the property market, especially as interest rates peaked, those prices came back down. I know that, in Victoria, and I've been saying this on this channel for many times, there was no other property market in that space at the time where you could get $1 million discount. That was properties that were selling in the peak of the Victorian market at 2.5 million, which were then selling at the bottom of the Victorian market for 1.5, representing $1 million discount. And a lot of the sophisticated investors during those recession fear times will actually see that as an opportunity to invest. Now, again, capital, they may have strong businesses, they may have already other assets at play, but that is a time where they'll start to see where the economy is at its weakest point, and that's typically where the bargains are going to be had. So it doesn't necessarily mean that when interest rates are at their highest, the bargains are there. It's actually, believe it or not, when the economy is at its weakest, that's when the bargains are present. So one of the best times I can relate that to you, and that's where a lot of investors, especially globally, made a lot of money, is when the US was on its knees, and that was post-Great Financial Crisis, or otherwise known as the GFC. Their rates were almost at 0%. Their economy was absolutely buggered. They weren't importing, they weren't exporting. No one wanted to touch the US. Their credit rating was shot, and that's where a lot of wealth was made for a lot of wealthy people. They swooped in, bought things on heavy discounts on the back of a genuine recession. Now, I'm not praying and hoping for a recession for Australia. I actually hope that the economy continues to bubble along and do very well, and we come out of this bit of the hard period we've experienced with higher rates, and we come back to a very flourishing economy. But if you've saved your pennies during those periods of times of high interest rates have started to retract and the economy still hasn't picked up, you might find yourself in a position where there's some really good bargains. It may not necessarily be property, it may be equities, or it may be other assets. But off the back of recession, you will find then increases, and that's where your money sits in the market at a better time. So if you are following global news, as I said it earlier before, you've got places like New Zealand, property prices coming down, America, property prices coming down, China, the land of 30-year growth in properties, that's been coming down. Australia's been very much insulated because we still have a good amount of migrants coming into the country. We still have a lack of supply of properties in the space, so it is definitely keeping demand quite strong. I don't think we're going to be seeing a property market like we've seen at the moment in New Zealand, China or America, but nevertheless, businesses have still been doing it tough and been doing it tough for the last 12 months. It will take time for them to recover. Employees may be doing all right at the moment because wages are getting paid, or if you've been made redundant, it's a different story. But nevertheless, small business in the country has had a little bit of a hard trot the last 12 to 18 months, especially people in construction. There hasn't been a lot of new dwelling starts. There hasn't been significant infrastructure starting, from government, state level and federal level. And construction people, well, they're getting a little bit of an averaging out now of their incomes over the last, say, 5 years. So there's definitely been some slowing down of the small business economy. Money's not moving as rampant as it was. And that's where potentially a recession might come from. But it may not be a recession of global financial crisis type of level. It may be still a recession where our growth is limited to nil or maybe even slightly negative. A little bit of a negative movement down, a little bit of a negative movement up is, in my mind, still a very stagnant economy. It's where we get drastic drops down. That's where there might be opportunities. But with that comes obviously a little bit of turmoil around the dropping of the economy. So they're things you need to consider. You need to be up to date with global economic times. You need to be understanding what's happening in places like the US. You need to understand geopolitical tensions, what that does to a market. You need to understand other property markets because, again, they're based on loans and leverages. And people think that, we may not be worried or, we could be insulated what happens in New Zealand. But there are some major banks from Australia that are lending in New Zealand. And if it's not doing well there, well, what happens here in Australia? So there's some things to think about. Recession, good investors will look at that as an opportunity. So I'd definitely say if you've saved your pennies, there might be some opportunity there if we do fall into a genuine recession. I don't think it's going to be of global financial scale crisis. However, if we start to see a continuing retraction of small business and it doesn't recover as quick, that's when one would argue that we're in a genuine recession, negative decline on a quarter-by-quarter basis of GDP. Keep your eyes open for more tariffs. I'm Jeremy Iannuzzelli. If you're really loving this content, follow us. Make sure you hit like or subscribe on YouTube's, iTunes and Spotify. Really looking forward to seeing you next week.